So I learned how to stick up for myself by watching my mom throughout my life, and I learned how to show compassion for other people by watching my dad throughout my life. And they both taught me, they always taught me that my actions have consequences, and that sometimes doing the right thing means that you're going to miss out on certain opportunities. So, my mom, Ruby Lee Williams, it was the summer, and Ruby, my mom, had wrote out a chore list for my brother and I to complete by late afternoon. And we used to like to joke around that our parents only had children for the free labor. And this was a day where it definitely felt that way. It was the weekend, so my dad was in the office taking care of some things, and my mom was driving around town getting the things that she wasn't able to get to during the week. And this list consisted of mow the lawn, weed the lawn, water the lawn, water the garden, weed the garden, clean out the garage, you name it, and my brother and I were doing it. And being that this was a Michigan summer, meant that we were being attacked by bloodthirsty mosquitoes while being melted by the punishing humidity of Michigan. And we didn't dare go into the house to cool off, to get dirt on my mom's clean floor. That wasn't gonna happen. So what we did was we would take drinks from the garden hose every once in a while. And this, of course, was before we knew that we were poisoning ourselves with toxic plastic from the garden hose. So everyone was doing that. And my brother, Benji, who nobody calls Benji except for me, is 4.5 years older than me. And he's never treated me like a kid. He never talked to me like a kid. But every once in a while, he would pull rank. And this was a day that he pulled rank. So that meant that I was the one that was doing most of the weeding. Because when you're young, weeding sucks. And it sucks mainly for two reasons. It's hard and it's boring. So by the time that my mom drove up into the driveway and she was honking the horn of the minivan, I was slightly dehydrated and I was just in pain. But I knew what was expected, so I ran up to the minivan and I helped her unload it. I took the garden supplies that she just bought and I put them into the garage, which was now clean. And then my brother and I helped her with that week's groceries, obviously taking our shoes off before we went into the house. And then my mom surprised us. And she said, "Hey, freshen up. I'm gonna take you boys to a late lunch." We were like, "Word, late lunch, boom." And she goes, "By the way, Red Lobster." It's like ding, ding, ding. Because I was in elementary school, but I'm old enough to know that Red Lobster at the time meant good eating. So I ran into the bathroom, I washed my face, I put on some new clothes, and I got in that van, and we took off. Red Lobster was about 5 minutes from our house, but I was planning it out. I was like, "Ooh, okay. And I settled on it. I was like, I'm gonna get the endless breaded shrimp. And all that weeding will have been worth it. So I was like, yes. We pulled up to the restaurant and we got out. And we went in and we just waited. There were other families coming, there were families going, and we waited. 5 minutes goes by, 10 minutes goes by, and then my brother's like, and I look up and I notice that my mom is now standing. Ruby is standing. And she is clearly trying to make eye contact with the host. And at that exact moment, a family comes in that I actually knew, and they're immediately seated. And my mom, this is all she needed, she walks up to the host and she starts to have a conversation. She starts to have a conversation with the host. And the thing is my parents knew a lot of people in East Lansing, Michigan, which is where I'm from. They were very involved in the community, And their sons, me and my brother, we went to school with and we played sports with what felt like all of East Lansing's children. So when my mom started talking to the host and having a conversation, people in Red Lobster started paying attention. And even though I was in elementary school, I was paying attention too. And I had noticed that we were the only people of color in Red Lobster. And I had also noticed that white family after white family after white family had come in and gone in before us, and my mom had reached her limit. So my mom is from Columbus, Mississippi, and she was born and raised there, and she was born and raised there in the late 50s, right? Exactly. So she endured a racism and a sexism in that way that only the South can really deliver. And I've been there. I spent my summers there. I know exactly what I'm talking about. So this woman who was raising 2 children and was working part-time for the NAACP had just reached her limit. And she was not yelling, but she was absolutely forceful. And every point that she was making, the whole place just got quieter and quieter. And my brother and I kind of inched closer and closer to each other because we both knew what it was like to be on Ruby Williams' shit list. And it is not good to be on Ruby Williams' shit list. So the manager ended up coming out. And he comes out and he hears what's going on and he just starts apologizing. He starts apologizing to my mom. It's like, I'm sorry, blah, blah, blah. And then he offers us a free lunch. And at this, I was like, free lunch? So I straightened up, right? Because the only thing better than endless breaded shrimp is free endless breaded shrimp. But I'm checking out my brother, and he's just slumped over still. He's 4.5 years older than me, right? So he knew what was coming. Without missing a beat, my mom was like, no, thank you. I do not want a free lunch, and I will never come into this place again. But what I will do is tell my friends and family exactly how you treated me and my 2 sons. And then she ushered us out of the restaurant and in to the van. So the drive back home definitely felt longer than 5 minutes. And it was quiet. But my brother and I weren't upset at all. We were not upset and we were not embarrassed because my mom had long before then taught us that there's nothing wrong or shameful when you stick up for yourself or when you expect people to treat you with respect. So that night, my dad gets home, trying to tell him what happens, and he fires up the grill, and we just eat. We eat like royalty. It's delicious. To this day, I never got my endless breaded shrimp. I don't know what that experience is like. My guess is that it's amazing. But I've also never stepped foot inside of a Red Lobster. My dad, Benjamin Carlton Williams. So, yeah, okay. I love my dad, so I appreciate it. I was on my grandmother's couch. It was covered in plastic. And I heard this screech and then a crash. And we had been listening to my dad's mom talk about how sore her feet were, and she was sitting in her favorite chair, and she was only wearing a robe with curlers in her hair. And this was one of the many weekend trips that I took, just me and my dad, took together to visit his family back in Detroit. So when we heard the noise, we all went running onto my grandmother's porch, and we noticed that it felt like the whole neighborhood was out, kind of looking in one direction. And by the time I figured out what was going on and I looked in that direction, my dad was already halfway moving towards the commotion. And what I saw was a red motorcycle crumpled up on one side of the street, and on the other side of the street was this man in a helmet, and he was kind of crumpled up on that side. And my dad was headed right towards him to help him up. And this guy was wearing a red helmet, a red jacket, red pants, red shoes, and my dad was right there. And he's helping him up. And the guy takes off his helmet, and I realize that, oh, he's not so much of a man, but he's more of a boy. I also noticed that his pants are just shredded, and his arm is bleeding. And he takes out this red rag out of his back pocket, and he wraps his arms to stop the bleeding. So I'm in middle school by this time, and I've spent a lot of time in Detroit. And I know what that color means in my grandmother's neighborhood. It means keep your distance. It means don't talk to me, don't look at me, don't fuck with me. But my dad, Benjamin Carlton Williams, who was born and raised in Detroit, who is a nerd, is just the biggest nerd in the world. He's so gentle. He didn't care about anything that color meant. All he saw was a human being who was hurt and needed his help, and that's what he was doing. So he brought this boy, because he wasn't a man, back to the car that was parked in front of my grandmother's house. And he opened up the passenger side, and he was letting him sit down. And I took this opportunity to run to the car and kind of squeeze into the back seat. And then my grandmother calls out, "Benny!" Because that's what she called my dad. "Benny!" in a warning tone. And my dad just kind of ignored her. And then he looks at me with narrowed eyes in the back seat, and I can tell that he's, should I tell him to get out? But he doesn't. He just gets in the driver's seat, closes the door, and we take off. The hospital is a few miles from my grandmother's house. But my dad, born and raised in Detroit, he knew two things. He knew that nobody called an ambulance, and he knew that an ambulance was never going to come. So we took off for the hospital. And as we're driving, my dad strikes up a conversation with this complete stranger. And I'm just in the backseat quiet. And in a matter of minutes, they are talking like family. This dude is laughing, my dad's laughing, and they're connecting. It turns out both born and raised in Detroit, both from that neighborhood, both actually even went to the same high school. Except whereas my dad went on to go to Michigan State University, this dude had dropped out a couple years ago. And just in that moment, my dad is showing this kid, I care about you enough to ask about your life and to make this connection, and I'm taking all of this in. And he's in the middle of telling this dude, hey, I think you should go back to school, actually, and is explaining to him the GED program when we pull up to the hospital's emergency parking lot. Turns off the car, we get out, my dad helps the dude, and I'm just following behind, silent. We walk into the hospital waiting area, they go up to the desk to talk about some things, and I just wait. After like a minute, they come to where I am, and we sit down, and we just kind of wait. And then a wheelchair is brought out. And this dude gets into the wheelchair, and he shakes my dad's hand. And he just has a big smile on his face, and he's shaking my dad's hand, and he's shaking it in a way that as my dad's son, made me a little jealous because I love my dad. I love my dad. And I noticed I was feeling a little jealousy. But he's shaking my dad's hand, big smile on his face, and I knew he didn't want to let go, but he did. And then he reaches into his front pocket, and he pulls out what at the time looked to me to be like $1 million. Just a fat knot of cash rolled up, and he hands it to my dad. And my dad, no, that's okay. And I'm sitting there silently, but in my head, I'm like, take the money! Take that money! But my dad's like, no. And the guy just smiles. He puts the money back in his pocket, shakes my dad's hand again, and they wheel him off behind those double doors. And my dad and I walk back to the car. It's kind of quiet. We get in. We start driving back to my grandma's house. And finally, I look at my dad and I go, Dad, why didn't you take that money? And he starts to answer, but I cut him off. And I just start listing all the things that I could have bought with that money. It's mainly like toys and candy and food. But I'm just listing it. I'm explaining to this man who I love how he ruined my life by not taking that money. And I finally shut up. And I ask him again. I say, why didn't you take that money? He's just driving. Christopher, we both know where that money came from. Just silence. We just drive back to my grandma's house in silence. We both know where that money came from. So my parents, they taught me a lot. They taught me that my actions matter. How I talk to people matters, and how I treat people matters. But the number one thing that both Ruby Lee Williams and Benjamin Carlton Williams taught me was that who I am matters. Thank you.